Shalom. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue. Welcome to our home. This is our weekly Torah study. We are doing the Torah study from home because that's kind of the way that it works best for us. We may be restarting, the in-person Torah studies sometime in the future, but for now we're just recording these from our home. A couple announcements before we get started this week. First of all, we are open with our Shabbat services at Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue here in Fort Myers. We will be continuing our live stream so you can view the service at home, but we are open for services. So if you would like to come out and fellowship and worship with us, then that would be a delight for all of us. You can also see the services continuing on YouTube and on our website and Facebook and so forth. And you can also see these midweek teachings on YouTube and Facebook and so forth. Please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. This gives you the updates and notifications that you need whenever we post another teaching or another service. I also wanted to take a moment and say thank you to all of you who are supporting this ministry. It is a humbling thing to me that you would partner with us in the work of the Ruach and the Spirit in this ministry. It's our desire to proclaim the gospel of Yeshua, which is written from the Torah through the Brit Chadashah, up and through its being written upon our hearts. And so this is kind of our vision, and I just want to thank you for your partnership and your support of us in this vision, in this sort of ministry that we do. If this ministry is a blessing to you, and if you feel moved by the Spirit, please consider supporting us with a donation or your regular donations. You can click in the description below to donate. And that's how we do that online. Okay, moving forward. This week's Parsha is Shalach Lecha, when you set up. It's found in Bamidbar, Numbers, chapters 13 through 15. We'll go ahead and just summarize the Parsha to start with. The Parsha opens with the narrative of the 12 spies who were sent in to survey the land as a precursor to their invasion, to their going into the land. Notice that they're not going in at the Jordan, at the Yarden, near Jericho. They are going in to the south at the wilderness of Paran. So the spies go into the land. They go in to spy it out, to see the bounty of the land. It's a great land flowing with milk and honey, it said, except the people in it are powerful, and they live in fortified cities. So the people began to be dismayed and distressed. And Caleb, in the English translation, Kalev, quiets the people because they were upset, in order to persuade them that they can indeed go into the land and so forth. But the response was, the men who had gone up with him said, "We cannot attack these people. They are stronger than we." And they spread among the children of Israel a bad report about the land which they had explored. And they have this line: "We seemed like grasshoppers in our eyes and in theirs." And so what we see happening after this is that all through the night, the people, the children of Israel, wept. They raised up their voices. This is a language in the Torah that's used to describe despair. When somebody raises up their voice, they raise up their voice in despair. They said, "Let's choose a leader and return to Egypt. Let's go back to Egypt." Another "let's return to Egypt" complaint, which is a recurring theme among the people. Moses and Aaron respond to this by falling on their faces, and Caleb and Joshua respond to this by tearing their clothes. And we notice here that Joshua was not named when Caleb tried to encourage the people to go in the land, but he is named later. And Caleb and Joshua tried to rally the people to go in the land. And then we have this line, which is a little frightening, that the entire community threatened to stone them. The whole community talked violently about stoning them. Then the glory of Adonai appeared to all the people. Remember, this is in context with the glory of the cloud and fiery pillar guiding them every day. Their grumbling and their rebellion was in the context, in the proximity of the cloud and the fiery pillar. Their grumbling and rebellion was, in effect, in the face of Adonai, in the shadow of the cloud. Adonai says to Moses, I will strike all them with a plague, but you I will make into a great nation. We have this kind of Noahide scenario where, like Noah, Adonai is threatening to destroy them and start over. Moses has this very curious exchange with Adonai. He says, you brought the people out of Egypt by your power, but this is the complaint, or this is the concern, is that the other nations around are going to say you brought them out by your power, but you couldn't get them into the land. It's almost like the other nations are going to say, wow, you delivered them from Egypt, but you couldn't get them to obey you. Or you brought them out of Egypt, but you couldn't make them love you. And so Adonai responds with a plague, punishing them with a plague, and then the exiles, the remaining generations, are left to wander in the desert for 40 years until that entire generation has died out, except Joshua and Caleb. And this includes Moses and Aaron and Miriam also dying out in this time of wandering in the desert. So Moses explains all this to the people. Remember when they spent the night in despair. Now again they are in despair. And this time it's for their failure to trust Adonai and go on up into the land. So the people decide that they're going to go into the land themselves, without the cloud and without the column and without the ark and without Moses. And they are immediately defeated in battle with no possibility of victory. So this is the episode of the spies. It's a very sad episode in our history. And the very next line in the Torah we have is this, chapter 1 of the next chapter, or verse 1 of the next chapter. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Bnei Israel, and say to them, when you enter the land that I am giving you, where you will make your homes. Adonai immediately pivots and begins to talk about what's going to happen when they get into the land of Israel. He's just banished them to wandering in the desert, and we have this graphic and brutal description that their corpses are going to fall in the desert, and they will die in the desert, and it isn't until all of them die of this generation that they are finally allowed to enter the land. And then Adonai says this, when you get there, again Adonai spoke to Moses saying, when you enter the land that I am giving you. Adonai then gives some instructions and some laws with this declaration, this sort of promise, when you enter the land. How can Adonai say this? How can God say, by what measure does Adonai guarantee or assure that they're going to be successful at entering into the land? These instructions apply to both the native born and to the foreigner. We have this, you shall have one law. Verse 15, the community will have the same rule for you as well as for the resident outsider. It will be a lasting statute throughout your generations. As for you, so for the outsider will it be before Adonai. The same Torah and the same regulations will apply to both you and the outsider residing among you. So here's what it is that yes, there are some specific instructions to living in the land of Israel, specific instructions to those born from one or so tribes of the Israel. There are some specific instructions to the people of Israel, but you can assume from this reading here that anything that isn't specifically identifying Israel or a Levite or something like this, anything that doesn't specifically apply to Israel, it says it applies to the foreigner residing among you and the outsider residing among you. So it is tying the obedience of the law and the Torah to residence in the land of Israel, in this land, this promised land. And we understand this, that the land belongs to Adonai, and it is his land that Israel is the caretaker of. So we see this, that Adonai reserves the law as applicable to the foreigner in the land of Israel. Next we have a passage addressing and one more point that I wanted to make with that is also the assumption that the foreigner is going to be attracted to the land of Israel, that Israel will be a place of pilgrimage for foreigners, that there will be foreigners living among them, and that when they do, they will be required to follow the same laws of Adonai. So it assumes and concludes, rightfully so, that people are going to be drawn to Israel. All right, next we have the passage addressing unintentional sins. The sages teach that these are not referring just to personal, unintentional, inadvertent sins, sins that you didn't know, as if somebody explains to you that you're not to move your neighbor's boundary stone and you've moved your neighbor's boundary stone. It's an inadvertent sin. Or perhaps maybe it's a little more esoteric than that. Perhaps it refers to the tzitzit. If somebody did not know that they were instructed to wear the tzitzit, they sinned inadvertently. And so this is a part that teaches us about those inadvertent sins. But the sages teach that these are not referring just to that, those personal unintentional sins, inadvertent sins, but also to transgressions that were committed by following our leaders, such that when you follow a leader, the leader chooses a direction, the leader chooses a methodology. So in our tradition, we have the halakha, we have the laws and the practices of the laws that have been handed down. And if somehow we inadvertently sinned in following our leaders, that this is what is taught here and addressed here in this passage. And it makes sense, because in that the 10 spies were guilty of greater sin than the people who followed them. The people who followed them inadvertently, if you will, following the 10 spies. This is what the sages teach in this passage. And the inadvertent sins are in the context of being misled by leaders, as everyone was misled by the bad report. The truth of the matter is most people are somewhat sensitive or sometimes very vulnerable to the things people say. Our youngest is 6 now, and we have watched as there's a gap between the youngest and the next oldest of about 10 years. And so we, as children get older, they get more resilient and they're able to kind of roll with the punches, so to speak. And we watched as our youngest was very vulnerable and susceptible to any kind of negativity. And it became a lesson for us that his vulnerability was just a reminder that we're all somewhat and sometimes incredibly vulnerable to any kind of negativity. And in a sense, all of us are vulnerable to our leaders. Our leaders have a great deal of our investment, our loyalty, and our fealty. And this is right, and this is appropriate, but this gets us into a difficult place when our leaders bring us a bad report about something or someone or some place. Next, we have the episode of the man gathering wood on Shabbat. And this man is put to death by the community at the direction of Adonai. Notice that they're not eager to put this man to death. They already knew that the Sabbath keeping required capital punishment for transgression. That was already stated. So in one sense, the man was willing to risk the offense. In one sense, it was he was tempting the community to see what they would do and see how they would respond. In Shemot, Exodus chapter 31, it says this, "Speak now to Bnei Israel, saying, Surely you must keep my Shabbatot, my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, so that you may know that I am Adonai who sanctifies you. Therefore you are to keep the Shabbat, because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it will die." So, in a sense, we already had this instruction. Bnei Israel, the people of Israel, were not eager to put this man to death. They caught him gathering wood on Shabbat, and they brought him to Moses to figure out what to do with him. Moses inquired of Adonai, and Adonai said, yes, he needs to be put to death, and so he was. Finally, we have the instruction about the tzitzit, so that we won't go around wherever our own heart and our own eyes lead us to prostitute ourselves. So we don't just become pragmatists, picking and choosing the law at our own discretion, deciding for ourselves what we will and won't do. There's something wrong about a sort of consumer-driven, self-will-driven, humanist-driven approach to the truth of God and to the law of God. The law of God was meant to be cultivated and expressed in relationship, both in the assignment of the law and in the obedience of the law. So we have this whole section of laws after the narrative of the spies. And just before the next narrative we have, the next passage is the Chloric Rebellion in the next portion. As if Adonai is giving them assurances. You give instructions to people. You're going to give the law to people whom you haven't given up on. And I guess this is the place that I want to go with this week, is that Adonai hasn't given up on these people. He hasn't given up on them in spite of all their grumbling, in spite of all their failure. He hasn't given up on them in spite of the fact that they're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and none of them are going to enter the land. We have 3 episodes of major failure on the part of Israel: the sin of the golden calf, the sin of the Chloric Rebellion, and the sin of the spies. These 3 episodes linger in our national conscience for the duration of the time in the wilderness, and even longer. We look at the sin of the golden calf now and we ask ourselves, how could they do this? And likewise, the sin of the spies in the land. I think if we dig a little deeper, we find some compelling truths of self-awareness, and we can see ourselves in the spies, especially during these turbulent times. The overwhelming expression of our times is fear. It's absolute fear. There's fear expressed in the coronavirus. There's fear expressed in the rioting. There's hopelessness expressed in people's fear, and hopelessness expressed in people's violence. What we have here is an expression of hopelessness. The people stayed up all night mourning and crying at the report of the spies. They were hopeless. They didn't know what to do with themselves. Surely perhaps some of you or somebody you know has gone through a major crisis in their life, and they just want to go back to a simpler time. They want to go back to when they were 20 or when they were 30 or when they were 40, when things were easier. Perhaps a person has gone from being an employee to starting their own business, to growth, to prosperity, and then they, through a series of failures, lose everything. And they don't want to pick up the pieces and move on. They want to go backwards. They want to go back to a simpler time. I think most of us can resonate with that. I think most of us can relate to that kind of sentiment. And in that sense, we might have some sympathy for the people upon when they received this report from the spies, were desperately disappointed and frightened, and just wanted to go back to something they knew. Returning to the devil you know versus the devil you don't, if you will, which is a cliche from our culture. Returning to the evil of Pharaoh and the people, as if you were going to go back and be received warmly and welcomed in Egypt. Like you were going to go back to Egypt, and they were going to say, well, it's fine that you went wandering around the desert for 2.5 years, and you spent some time at the base of that mountain and you made a nice tent, but welcome back to Egypt, and you can have your old home and you can have your old job back, which in fact was slavery. I don't know that was going to be the welcome they were going to receive when they went back to Egypt, but none of that matters. It's an entirely irrational discussion. It's an entirely broken discussion, spoken out of their brokenness and out of their fear. We can see ourselves in the spies, especially during these turbulent times, where irrational fear is kind of ruling much of what we do. There's some caution and there's prudence that can be taken, but it's the level of fear that you see in people's eyes that is the real evidence of the times. Notice at the outset of the episode of the spies that Adonai is sending the prince of each tribe. These are the leaders of their tribes. Remember in the previous portion when Adonai sent out and gathered 70 elders of the tribes and had them arrayed around the Mishkan, around the tabernacle. and they were given a portion of the Spirit that Adonai had laid upon Moses. The spies here are likewise leaders of their tribe, but one step further, they're actually immortalized forever in history. By the time this episode is written down, it has already happened. Now, why was it necessary to write their names down? Why was it necessary to name each one by name, son of, son of, son of? It's a somewhat almost may seem like a punitive gesture. You're named, you're immortalized forever in history. Is it merely to shame them? Is it merely to make sure that nobody forgets what a terrible thing happened here? Is Adonai making sure that we know their sin throughout all generations? Because it was effective. We have never forgotten these names. These names are still written down, and everyone can reference these names. Remember what Yeshua said, not one yud or stroke of the law of the word will be struck down until everything that must happen has happened. What was the purpose of this? That these names would be in writing forever. Let me suggest to you the hint that's revealed in the text. In Exodus, Shemot, chapter 33, we have the episode of Moses after interceding for Israel. This is after the episode of the golden calf, one of these great, shame and guilt moments in the lives of the people of Israel. So Moses has this rather audacious statement. He says to Adonai, "Now please show me your glory." Do you notice that Moses' greatest moments of intercession, his greatest moments of audacity, his greatest moments of breakthrough with Adonai is when the people are going through a crisis. The people are going through a crisis at the sin of the golden calf, and Moses says, "Now show me your glory." And so we have in the next chapter, 33, verse 19, "I will cause all my goodness to pass before you and call out the name of Adonai before you. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy upon whom I will be merciful." He also said, "You cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live." So we have this, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, I will show mercy upon whom I will show mercy. You can interpret this mercy and graciousness two ways. That Adonai will choose grace and mercy regardless of what others would want to do. That Adonai would choose to be gracious when other people wouldn't. That Adonai would choose to be merciful when others wouldn't. But the other aspect of this is that the reminder that if Adonai chooses punishment or guilt, that guilt and that punishment will stand. I will choose mercy when I choose mercy. With the conclusion being, the implication being that if I do not choose mercy, I do not choose mercy. I will be merciful on whom I choose, which follows that he will not be merciful on whom he chooses. Okay, next chapter, Shemot 34, verse 5. Adonai descended in the cloud, stood with him there as he called on the name of Adonai. So Adonai comes down, stands with Moses as Moses calls upon the name of Adonai. Then Adonai passed before him and proclaimed, "Adonai, Adonai," that is the Yud He Vav He, the name of God, "the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abundant in loving kindness and truth, showing mercy to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin." The line doesn't end there, but I'm going to pause there. So Adonai is declaring what? He's declaring his compassion, his graciousness, his abeyance of anger, his abundance in loving kindness and truth, and he's showing mercy to 1,000 generations. And then moving on, it says, "Yet by no means leaving the guilty unpunished, but bringing the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation." So what you have here is a comparison. Mercy is projected to the 1,000th generation, guilt to the 3rd and 4th. Adonai chooses to emphasize mercy and compassion and forgiveness. In fact, it's woven into his name, the Yud He Vav He. There are statements of these compassions, that Adonai is and was and always will be, that he never changes, which is a statement of compassion. He will always be there for you. He will always be available for you. He will always be for you. That never changes. I think one of the problems that we have is that we have a tendency to equate forgiveness and mercy and compassion with a dismissal of punishment and consequence. That is to say that we think that forgiveness and mercy and compassion is accomplished through the dismissal of guilt. And what Yeshua has offered us is our guilt is dismissed because the punishment and consequence have been satisfied. Remember, it's the law of sin and death is the consequence of death as a result of sin. Here is the dangerous ground that we can get into, the vulnerability we can get into when we equate forgiveness with dismissal. The dismissal is absolutely tied to the sacrifice of Yeshua. It's the only way you get the dismissal is through the sacrifice, and the text says that, the Bible says that it is through the shedding of blood that accomplishes the forgiveness of sins. If we say that Adonai forgives and there's no grounds for punishment or no grounds for consequence, if there's no, if it's just dismissal of the law based on the forgiveness and graciousness of Adonai, and that there is a school of thought out there that teaches that the law is dismissed because Adonai is gracious and kind and compassionate and forgiving. He's gracious and kind and compassionate and forgiving because Yeshua bore all the consequence, bore all the wrath. If you say that Adonai forgives and that forgiveness is a dismissal of the law, then what you have is no need or reason for the death and sacrifice of Yeshua. There's no reason for the death and sacrifice. And people conclude, falsely, I'm sorry, that the death and sacrifice of Yeshua are for the dismissal of the law. And that's just not the case. Yeshua said, "Do not think I came to abandon the law or to abolish the law." It's a complex discussion to trace out all the avenues and paths of grace and forgiveness and consequence and effect. But suffice it to say, Adonai chooses mercy and forgiveness, which is why he listens to Moses in this current portion. When Moses intercedes for Israel, and the next words are, "When you enter the land," Adonai is expressing a form of forgiveness. When you enter the land, I have forgiven you, so I'm not giving up on you. When you enter the land, you're going to enter the land. Moses has this intercession that he has with Adonai, even beyond that of what we're speaking of here. Moses has this curious intercession that he performs with Adonai. The first thing he says is that the other nations are going to hear about it, and that Adonai could not bring them into the land. And second, that Adonai is a God of compassion, quoting Adonai when he revealed himself to Moses. From Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 14, verse 17. "So please, Adonai, let Adonai show his strength," that is, show your strength, "just as you have spoken, saying, Adonai is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression. Still, he does not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations. Forgive now the guiltiness of this people in accordance with the greatness of your loving kindness, just as you have pardoned this people from Egypt until now." And then moving on, verse 23, we have this, that Caleb is singled out in Adonai's response. Adonai comes back and says in response to Moses, "Not one of them will see the land that I promised to their forefathers. None of those who treated me with contempt will see it. However, my servant Caleb, because a different spirit is with him, and he is wholeheartedly behind me, I will bring him into the land where he went. His offspring will inherit it." And I didn't pull it up, and I'm sorry that I didn't, but let me see if I can get to it quickly, and that is the Hebrew on that verse, which is, let me find it here, Bamidbar, and I'm sorry for the delay. We are in chapter 14, And we are down around, let me see if I can find it here. See, it's 24 and change. Here we go. 2, 4. 24, verse 24. Ve'abdi Kalev Echeb Hayata Aheret Hayata Ruach Aheret Imau Acheret Imau Ve'malei Ahare Vahavilo Vahaviati El Haaretz, into the land Asher Ba, the land which he went, Asher Ba, and his descendants will inherit it. So here we have this calling out of Caleb, and the part that I wanted to bring to your attention is this the land in which he went into, the land in which he comes into or he goes into. Caleb is a passionate and very successful warrior for the kingdom of God when it comes to the conquest of Canaan. And what we see is that he goes into it very aggressively and is very successful. And we have a calling out of that through this Hebrew passage here. And it's specific to Caleb. Joshua is left out of this passage. He's referenced here in a moment, but he's left out of this passage. My servant Caleb, because a different spirit is with him, and he is wholeheartedly behind me. What is this different ruach? What is a different spirit that is referenced here? Remember the spirit that was upon Moses that was laid on these 70 leaders. And one of the questions that you would have at this time is, well, was some of the princes of the 12 tribes from among the 70 leaders who did receive the ruach, the spirit that Adonai had put on Moses? A portion of that spirit was put on these 70 leaders. Are any of these 70 leaders likewise represented here among the 12 spies? And it's a reasonable question to assume that perhaps there is. But if nothing else, we have Caleb, who is called out for his faithfulness and his hope by Adonai, even more so than Joshua was. Notice that Joshua was silent when the people first began to fear. Later he tore his clothes and tried to encourage the people with Caleb. But at first it was Caleb who was vocal. This is where Adonai says he has a different spirit and he is wholeheartedly behind me. We have, that at first Caleb was wholeheartedly behind Adonai. The last thing I'd like to bring to your attention here for you to notice is that while all the spies were named, Joshua has his name changed from Hoshea in Hebrew to Yehoshua. What that is in the Hebrew is loosely translated from salvation, Hoshea, salvation, to God is my salvation, Yehoshua. Because what's going to be accomplished here? These people are going to go in, they're going to spy out the land, they're going to come back and they're going to bring a report. And the report is going to be that the people are fearful and cannot enter the land. They fear they are unable to accomplish the victory. They were unable to deliver themselves, in effect, is what you could say of it. They were unable to provide for their own salvation. They were unable to enter in by their own strength. It is Adonai who is their salvation. It is Adonai who is our salvation. We see the name Adonai is my salvation here when Hoshea was named Joshua. Adonai is my salvation. we see the name Adonai is my salvation here. In Joshua chapter 5, when Joshua steps into the fullness of his mantle as a leader, we see again the man of salvation here as an appearance of Yeshua, the commander of the armies of heaven. If you turn to chapter 5, at the end of the chapter, you can see this reference to the commander of the armies of heaven. Who is not for men on one side or the other in a conflict. Most of us choose our sides in conflicts, but rather, excuse me, rather the conquest of Canaan was the conquest of Adonai against his own enemies for his own land. It's an echo or a foreshadow, rather, perhaps, of the victory to come. So it is that Joshua is named Adonai is my salvation. At the same time, all the other spies are named. And we see the role of the man of salvation at the conquest, the entrance of the conquest of Canaan under Joshua when he leads them out of the wilderness. Remember, just before this, Joshua chapter 5 narrative in Joshua chapter 2, Joshua sent out spies to spy out the land prior to them going into the land. So we've got a repeat. However, how many spies were sent out? There were only 2 spies that were sent out, as opposed to 12. They didn't represent all the tribes of Israel. I don't see that they're specifically referencing one of the tribes, but you could probably study that out and determine, perhaps using genealogies and so forth and references, just who is selected as a spy there in that moment. So what's the wrap up with all this? Where did we end up this week in this parsha? I think we have to resonate with the idea of us being very vulnerable to fear and to anxiety, and that, you know, if they were to come and say, our leaders were to say that, you know, we're going to have another pandemic, we're going to have another breakout, we're going to have another fill in the blank, that most people would be afraid. We have wrapped ourselves in fear like a garment over the course of the last 3 months. And we have made huge statements and made huge decisions affecting the economics of the world over this coronavirus sort of vulnerability. So, yeah, we know fear. We, as a people, we know fear, both believers and non-believers. In our day and age right now, we know fear. What is Adonai offering here? He's offering a way for us to avoid the fear. His allowing them to wander in the desert is at first a punishment, absolutely, because everybody needs to make aliyah. Everybody needs to make aliyah. Everybody needs to go to Israel. And they needed to go to Israel, and they failed the opportunity to go to Israel. But what you see now is you see a much greater lifestyle of obedience and faithfulness, such that when they enter the land of Israel, finally in the book of Joshua, one of the fascinating things about the book of Joshua is how little failure there is in it. There's very little failure. Judges, things get out of hand. By the end of Judges, we have this statement: everyone did what was right in their own eyes, you know, as opposed to the Torah or the rabbis or whatever. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so this is what we see, that at the beginning of Joshua, the beginning of the book of Joshua, for the most part, the people are pretty faithful and pretty obedient. All right. Where are we at in our world in COVID? We need to learn trust. We need to embrace trust. We need to acknowledge our weakness with trust and our vulnerability with trusting Adonai. And we need to fully embrace this. And we need to walk a road of discipline that will strengthen our trust and that will confront our fear. You know, we talked about this some weeks ago when they finally got rid of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And what did they do? They came up on bitter waters. And the waters were bitter and they couldn't drink. And we walked through what all those bitter waters meant. Yes, Adonai was leading them in the way in order to accomplish something in them, change and transformation and increased faith and strength. Likewise, we see that in our modern life, that Adonai is going to walk us down a road of discipline and of obedience that will have an effect, if we do it right, will have an effect of making us non-threatened and non-fearful, I believe, by certain things. There's always room for prudence. There's always room for caution. But I think what I'm concerned about is fear, especially to the point of it being irrational, in the same way that Israel was fearful. And the last thing I would say is just the obvious, that when Adonai is for us, who can be against us? And truthfully, I just don't know that they ever had that organization where they were willing to enter into the land under that framework, under that confidence. And yet God has given us grace and mercy, overcoming our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses, such that, yes, we can go out and fight the giants in the land. Remember, there were references here to the Anak, and who were descendants of the Nephilim, here in the land, giants in the land. And yet what do we see several generations later? We see David, and he's willing to take 5 stones, and he walks up to Goliath in the full view and in the full sense of trust in Adonai. So we have this Goliath was likewise likely a descendant of the Nephilim. So we have victory assured for us in the name of Yeshua. Doesn't mean that life isn't difficult. Doesn't mean that we don't have trials and struggles. But what it does mean is that we have his assurance and his faith. I'll leave it with you there. Shalom, shalom, everybody. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or any comments. And please give me a call if there's anything I can do. Blessings and shalom.